I'm Dane Rose, and in this video, I'll go through point by point why I do not recommend and strongly discourage someone from working with Peter Rengel in a therapeutic or a leadership role. So as I have experienced Peter Rengel, it's been as a facilitator for the Human Awareness Institute on workshops on love, intimacy, and sexuality. But I also understand that he leads meditative retreats and does unlicensed therapy. So all of these are leadership or educational roles. And while Peter Rengel has many great qualities and pluses and minuses, just like the rest of us, I would not recommend him for any form of leadership role relating to relationships or psychology. So there's a couple of parts to that, and I'll go through them in the abstract and then look at the details that I find concerning. In the area of psychology and personal relationships, one of the single biggest variables is trauma, PTSD, and histories of abuse, followed and concurrent with addiction, which includes all compulsive behavior. An addiction is a pain management strategy that ties into repeatedly and compulsively doing or thinking or watching or consuming something as a method for avoiding pain. And unfortunately, despite following Peter Rengel into some fairly deep water, I've taught or made an effort to teach Peter Rengel more about trauma and PTSD than he taught any of the groups that he led into traumatic terrain. The second thing with a leader, you can think of this as a group leader on an expedition. In order to lead, you need a couple of qualifications. One is you need to know if where you're leading someone is actually constructive terrain for the people you're leading them. If you're leading someone towards unnecessary pain and suffering, and you know it, then you're sociopathic. But if you don't know it, if you're taking someone towards harm and you lack the ability to tell whether that's the case or not, it's problematic. If you're going to take someone on an Everest expedition, for example, and you lack the ability to have, you have just no idea whether they'll come down the mountain alive, it's not necessarily a good pick for you to be the leader of the expedition. You may be a great cook, you may be able to make the expedition, but a leader needs to be able to evaluate if the people they are leading are going to benefit from being led where the leader is taking them and whether they can survive the journey. That's a very important characteristic of leadership. Similarly, if you were to hear of an expedition that inappropriately evaluated, its members' ability to make it there, but discovered, people with broken legs shouldn't go on expeditions. My bad. Unfortunately, we're going to leave you on the mountain because, while we didn't do our job to evaluate you for the group, and in fact encouraged you to come along with the broken leg. We don't know what to do in this situation, and so we're going to leave, and we're going to leave you, to die on the mountainside. This is not, the kind of behavior you want from a leader. And unfortunately, whether it's a therapeutic role or a psychological role or kind of a group facilitation role, in each of these cases, Peter Rengel is leading people into unknown terrain. If it was known terrain, his skills as a leader would be unnecessary. So it's unknown terrain. And you want someone who takes a fee particularly, because when in each of these roles, Peter Rengel is charging money to his clients, whether it's groups or individuals, to be guided to where he's taking them, which is, a psychological space, a physical space, an emotional space. And in that, there will be a shifting of identity. And identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And one hires a therapist or a guide with the purpose ultimately of shifting identity, meaning there'd be no basis to go to a workshop or do therapy if you knew that you would come out of the experience thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being exactly what you thought, felt, spoken, did, and how you were before the event. Medicine or therapy is about change. And the change occurs in the identity. And so there's a vulnerability. One is saying, okay, I know I'm going to come out changed. Will it be for the better? Will I like the me on the other side of the experience of the therapy more than I like the me going in? Because, to use a crude example, if we knew that we were going to have our leg amputated for no particular reason, if we went to the hospital, that's just what they did. Go to the hospital, which leg do you want? They chop the other one off, and there's your bill, and leave the hospital. Nobody would go to the hospital because we go to therapy, whether it's physical, emotional, mental therapy, for the purpose of coming out more whole than we went in. That's why we went to therapy. Now, if we come out cut into bits, something's wrong with the narrative. Now, this also then ties into the ability or, the aspect of gathering data. How would a hospital know that many of its patients came out worse than they went in if they didn't do some form of a survey? And so you want someone that's professing something, whether it's, you should buy our investment, you should let me massage your body, you should let me guide you into this terrain. You want them to be responsible to data, to be interested in their impact. And Peter Rengel has instead gone to great lengths to avoid being aware of and refuse to respond to his impact. So that's problematic if at the same time, he wants to continue having the privilege of having impact on other people. If he said, boy, I really didn't know what I was doing there, I'm going to kind of throw in the towel and not guide people, that would be a conscientious decision. It's my job to lead people in a healthy direction. But Peter Rengel has invested more energy in suppressing data about his competence than he has in reforming and responding to data about his competency. And some of that just, I'm not going to gather or be interested in feedback. The other thing that you have to be mindful of in any relationship with someone that you go into unknown terrain in is there an overpromising and under-delivering, or is there an under-promising and over-delivering? Because if the deliverable is good and someone says, you've got reasonable odds of coming out feeling a little better, but you've in fact got very good odds of coming out feeling a lot better in a sustainable manner, that's great. Because it doesn't feel good to wonder how much of the overpromising is a lie and how much of the overpromising is incompetence. Either way, it doesn't feel good if you're in the demographic that, this was what was stated and this is what you experienced. And Peter Rengel, in his capacity as a Human Awareness Institute facilitator, would always begin his workshops with me talking about his personal commitment to a world where everyone wins. Naturally, going into that in a little bit more detail might have been useful in avoiding a pretty big, and grandiose promise, because there are a lot of people not winning at the Human Awareness Institute, including Peter. And so what does that commitment mean? And I would suggest, if we follow this narrative, that in some areas, Peter is in fact committed to everyone losing, beginning with himself. And so, pretty big overpromise, commitment to the entire world winning, behavior that pretty much guarantees that anyone associated with Peter Rengel's behavior, not all behavior, of course, nobody's losing if Peter Rengel drinks a glass of water, but some of Peter Rengel's behavior guarantees that anyone associated with that behavior, including himself, loses. And so it creates, a certain schizophrenia, promising this commitment to a world winning, but in fact enacting behavior where everyone is guaranteed to lose, and where a competent person would look at that and say, of course, that's going to end up in harm. But it's not an area, that Peter Rengel wants to take a look at, which ties into, another aspect, which is also the elements of chauvinism. Because in order to teach something, a masculine role, whether it's a male or a female doing it, you have to be willing to continuously learn. And Peter Rengel has spent more energy in his relationship with the sexual abuse that I've experienced, suppressing the data and denying that it has anything to do with him, than he has spent learning about the data. All he had to do to learn about the data is accept my invitation to hear me and understand me. But that was too much of an ability to respond, a responsibility for Peter Rengel. So we have blind spots, but more importantly, blind spots about blind spots. We have negligence, but more importantly, a willingness to spend energy to bury the data. Peter Rengel has participated in a lawsuit to try and ensure that fewer people understood the dangers that as a group leader you want to be educating people about, not hiding. And so in that context, I do not recommend Peter Rengel in any form of leadership position. You want someone who isn't going to leave their troops behind. You know, in a military situation, who do the troops respect? It's, we will not be left behind by this general. This general is working on our side. It's a very compelling aspect that builds loyalty. And having gone through, you know, some of the deeper waters of my life, influenced strongly by Peter Rengel, you know, I can assuredly say that if things get really rocky, Peter Rengel will leave me, and by extension, anyone else that tries to communicate to him about some of his blind spots behind. And then the question is, well, what is then the basis for charging money to lead in this terrain? So, you know, very briefly, because it is a much bigger issue, Peter Rengel, in his capacity as a Human Awareness Institute facilitator, has taught tens of thousands of people, presumably about love and intimacy and sexuality. In order to work with something like this, love, you know, sexuality, you have to have some contrast. You have to know the difference between addictive lust or sex addiction, for example, and making love and love that leads to a healthy, growing container. Peter Rengel will not discuss this topic, and did not discuss it in, you know, the entire context of, you know, the workshops that he led. You need to know risks, which, as I say, are trauma and PTSD, addiction, betrayal, control. You need to know, you need to have a safe psychological discussion. Now, Peter Rengel is competent in facilitating a physical safe sex conversation. And it's very important to understand that the Human Awareness Institute workshops function very much like a drug. They will provide high stimulation in all of the internal chemicals in the body, creating a natural high. And in that state, a tremendous amount of proximity is occurring, and also a lot of fluidity in identity, shifts in the patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. However, there is not a competent set of tools to understand when one is being traumatized or re-traumatized. Now, this is problematic because a majority of Peter Rengel's students or participants or therapeutic patients are trauma survivors. So to be re-exposed to traumatic terrain without the vocabulary to navigate the distinction between love and lust, between addiction and love, you end up creating a dynamic where it's kind of like saying that food is good. When we're going to expose you to a lot of food, but we're not going to separate the different food into its constituents to say, well, this is arsenic and this is salt, and some salt is good, but not too much. And we're not going to go into any of the details. We're just going to define that this is the place of food and food is good. And this ties in with High's protocol at basically saying that the room that the workshop is in is the room of love. But we're not going to define what love is. We're not going to define what addiction is. We're not going to define what trauma is. We're not going to help you recognize traumatic symptoms. We're just going to say that whatever goes on in this room is love, because this is the room of love. It's a very self-referential identity where it's impossible for it to be wrong because love is good, and this is the room of love. But if someone is severely traumatized in this room, that then gets rebranded as a loving, growing event, as opposed to a severe trauma by incompetent facilitators. So a lack of distinction is perhaps the key thing. Now, part of the risk invisibility of Peter's work is that neither he nor any of the other facilitators disclose the fact that they're not licensed therapists. And then you come to think, well, if you're committed to the world where everyone wins, why weren't you committed enough to get licensed in knowing how to do your job? Because presumably, if you went through the course of learning how to be a top-notch therapist, you would do a better job than if you didn't bother to get licensed. So you start to see the divergence between we're committed, but we're not committed enough to actually learn what we're doing. And that's okay if you communicate to your people that we weren't committed enough to get licensed, and so we didn't get licensed. That's a lack of disclosure. If a drug like the family that made billions behind OxyContin talked about its wonderful pain relief, there's no doubt about it. Opioids will reduce pain. But they didn't tell the fact that they're highly addictive, that could lead to even more pain. See, the risk was not disclosed, and that's why the family that deliberately suppressed data about harm are facing public scorn and protest. Why was it that the FDA and our major pharmaceutical companies were colluding to attack, small homeowners that were growing poppies in their backyard, while the FDA approved OxyContin, and the family that made billions on the suffering of America was able to avoid the disclosure of the side effects? Because that's really Peter Rengel's crime, a commitment to avoiding the disclosure of the direct side effects of incompetence. And that's not the person you want to be getting medicine from. You want the person who says, I don't seem to know what I'm doing here. In this area, 10% of my clients are not happy. 5% of my participants seem to get really messed up after going through my trip here. And those are your risks. And I'm working hard to figure out why and to filter out the people that are getting harmed and to gather data. But you need to know that these are the risks. And obviously, if, I'm not intending, I'm not suggesting that Peter Rengel is going out of his way to ruin people's lives. I don't think he has to go out of his way. If he has enough blind spots and willful ignorance, I think he can do that, quite absent-mindedly. But it's not a terrain to be taken casually, particularly if it's a terrain that you wish to be a teacher and leader. Having gone through 30 workshops facilitated by Peter Rengel and his colleagues, I can safely say that upon graduating, I had a more confused definition of love than when I went in, but an undefined definition. And I say confused because in some of the later workshops, they will do the exact opposite of what you ask them to do. They'll say, raise a hand if you want to go first in the next exercise. And if you raised your hand that you wanted to go first, then they will make you go last and talk about how this is love. In other words, by the time you get to the end of Peter Rengel's protocol, you will be taught, in effect, that to be really advanced in love, you violate people, confuse them, do the opposite of what they want, and then just call it love because that's what we call this room. So that's problematic because no cogent definition, which they've never offered, would actually say love is doing the opposite of what your partner wants. If someone doesn't want to have sex with you, then just go ahead and have sex with them because that's love, right? And so obviously we're drifting into sadomasochistic behavior, and it's unfortunately undefined at every step. The risks are undefined, the lack of licensing is undefined, and you will be charged to be taught whatever it is this nonsense is, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that when somebody says they have this as a preference, that you would do the opposite and somehow expect kudos for being more loving or more advanced. It's just talking about the twisted phenomena that many of us experienced in childhood by our parents, who then called their punishment love, who called their lies and betrayal love. I lied to you because I loved you, right? So really, in many ways, Peter Rengel is pointing out the fact that he hasn't untangled the cross-wiring that is love by default. Your parent loves you, therefore the abuse that they're doing to you is love because their parent loves you. And so there's that kind of blind spot within the Human Awareness Institute, of which Peter has been a long-term leader. Now, Peter Rengel chose, trained, and recommended Peter Sandhill, who sexually abused me in a therapeutic session over a 10-year period. So my very first session with Peter Rengel, or with Peter Sandhill, who's Peter Rengel's protege, is that Peter Sandhill expresses sexual interest in me as an American male that's heterosexual. And so I'm paying to have my therapist express sexual interest in me. The only problem is I've learned about relationships and sexuality from the Human Awareness Institute. And so I don't know the difference between good therapy and bad therapy. And it hasn't been disclosed to me that Peter Sandhill, as well as Peter Rengel, is unlicensed. And I go away feeling worse and being more confused. And that was kind of a narrow escape from more severe abuse, because Peter Sandhill recommended that I pay him to do MDMA with him in his house. Now, you think of, a competent company or in group recommending a therapist, and it would be normal for if Peter Rengel is training and recommending an unlicensed therapist, it would be normal to do an exit form, an exit log, like how were you doing and what was your experience? Because an American is institutionally, psychologically, and relationally illiterate. Meaning, I can guarantee you I didn't learn about this at my house or in middle school or in high school or anywhere else in this culture. So we're institutionally blind, which means it's important who we trust and what their competency is. But nobody asks why you left your male therapist after they showed sexual interest in you. It's a don't ask, don't tell protocol at High. And that's negligent, because that could have stopped the next round of abuse. Because Peter Sandhill was very clear that his sexual interest in me was not abusive, was not traumatizing, was not confusing. It was love. It was because he loved me, right? Well, how many fathers say that to their 6-year-old daughters? This will be our little secret, right? But is it love to initiate sexual interest in a therapeutic client? Well, you have to look at the outcome. And admittedly, 12% of therapists in an anonymous study admit to having sexual relationships with some of their clients. Now, who do they pick? If a therapist, if they're narcissistic and sociopathic, their main concern will be losing their license. So who do you want? Well, of course, at the High organization, you don't have to worry about that because there's no license to lose. They didn't bother to get it in the first place. But who do you have to deal with? Like, who would you pick if you're a sociopathic therapist to sexually abuse and ask the client to pay for the abuse, reaffirming the definition that this isn't abuse, this is love, and so you should be paying me because I know more about love than you do? Who would you pick? A highly competent, self-aware person that says, get the hell out of here. I'm not paying you to seduce me in therapy. Get lost. Or would you try to seduce someone who's confused and isolated and perhaps has a sexual abuse history with parents that also like to pass off their incompetence and abuse in parenting as love? And I would suggest it's the latter. Whether it's criminals in jail, like they ask, male stalkers in jail, how do you pick your victim? And particularly serial sexual abusers will tell the interviewer in jail that they can tell by the body language of usually the woman who won't fight back, who will accept the abuse. And that's an easier target. It's a safer target than someone that might whip out a gun or call the police. And so therapists end up preying sexually on the people who are the most confused and vulnerable and isolated and cross-wired about love, because those people present the least threat to the therapist. Now, obviously, I showed up in that domain, right? Because Peter Sandhill expressed sexual interest in me in our very first session and was encouraging me to pay him to do MDMA with him a few sessions later. Now, you have to just look at the statistics of how many therapeutic patients who have sex with their therapists or are seduced by their therapists end up being better off because of the experience. So you didn't have sex with a therapist, you came to a therapist for help, you then were seduced by your therapist. For how many of you did that lead to a constructive growth and healthier relationships in your life? And for how many of you did that lead to more confusion and self-loathing and low self-esteem? Well, the statistics are very clear. If you as a therapist seduce your client, they have a 95% plus chance of being severely harmed by your behavior. Now, if a surgeon at Marin General gave a patient arsenic, knowing that there was a 95% plus chance that the patient would be severely harmed, what would we do with that surgeon? Try them for murder. Well, relationships in psychology are the inner world, which is the feminine counterpart to the outer world. On the outer level, we have a physical body. On the inner level, we have an emotional and mental body. And in a chauvinistic culture, those are just feelings. Those are just thoughts. Who cares? If Peter Sandhill had put a nail in the tire of my truck, we would be horrified. A therapist? Sabotage your truck? Because that's an outer physical thing. But that's only the blindness of chauvinism. We all understand, who have lived here for more than a decade or so, that you can fuck a person up a lot more by damaging their identity, by confusing them, by leaving them heartbroken, than you can by puncturing a tire. So why is that such an obvious crime, but incompetent therapy is just, they've done studies, and therapists that are at all interested in the well-being of their patients have made themselves aware of the fact that a large percentage of therapeutic clients leave therapy with little or no benefit. Some of them leave therapy in worse shape than when they arrived. And that's not good. We wouldn't tolerate that in an auto mechanic, would we? A percentage of the people who come out of this auto shop, they came in with 3 tires, and some of them leave with 2 tires. They were barely getting along with 3, now they've only got 2, and here's your $1,000 bill. We would never pay a bill for an auto mechanic to ruin our car. But that's because we actually understand that going from 3 tires to 2 tires is not improvement. In psychological terrain, in a psychologically illiterate culture, we do not understand. I'm sure there's plenty of sexual abuse survivors in this country who would say, wow, I get to have sex with my therapist? That's included in the package? Because in a psychologically illiterate culture, we're all too dumb to know that we're dumb. And that's the danger. Because if I had been raised in a psychologically competent culture, I would have known the difference between sexual abuse and love. But we managed to go through life in this culture professing love. I love you, love is a good thing. Can you give me a definition of what is and what isn't love that is well thought out? I'm waiting, because I've never heard one by a therapist or by an American. And that's the problem. If we think love is good, and we think food is good, but we don't make the distinction between arsenic and lettuce, it's a problem. Because you're lured into a false sense of safety as you fall over the cliff. And that's what happened to me when Peter Sandhill sexually abused me for the second time in 10 years, this time under the influence of my first psychedelic experience with mushrooms and MDMA. Now, I won't tell you, the full degree of incompetency that led me to experience massive PTSD and the biggest pain of my life, as Peter Sandhill successively made things worse over a 10-year period. But there are some alarm bells. Just before hiring Peter Sandhill the second time, I posted a public notice at the Human Awareness Institute talking about my intention to commit suicide. Now, you would think that an entire organization that is committed to a world where everyone wins would say, ding, 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 ding. Maybe we ought to actually see what's up. Maybe we have something to do with the suicidality of one of our own patients and participants who's done 30 workshops with us and worked with 4 facilitators. Maybe we have something to do with this. But this never occurs to a sociopath or a narcissist. There's nothing to do with us. We're committed to the world where everyone's winning. And it's about the symbol, the words. It's not about actually, are you winning? Because that's not a question you'll ever be asked at the Human Awareness Institute. I mean, if you're committed to everyone winning, you would think you'd start by asking who's winning and where are they winning and where aren't they? But that doesn't occur to them. The commitment to love and everyone winning, that occurs to them, to say it, to overpromise before under-delivering. So when you give an unlicensed therapist and carte blanche to interact with a patient on high doses of psychedelics, when they're in suicidal levels of pain due to prior incompetencies that you're involved with, it usually will end badly. When you throw in sex with your therapist on top of that, and it will likely end even worse. Now, the question is, what is Peter Rengel's response to hearing that his participant, who trusted his guidance, who's following his lead, is in a suicidal state? Well, 0 for that. And what about that he's been sexually abused by his buddy Peter Sandhill? What does Peter Rengel do in that moment, number one? And what Peter Rengel does, is it in the interest of his clients, of his participants, of the people who have trusted him as the facilitator of a public nonprofit? Is that where his focus is? Or is the focus on himself and protecting his buddy, Peter Sandhill, who he chose and who he trained and who he recommended in an unlicensed state? And if you look at whether it's the long list of emails with Peter Rengel saying he doesn't want to know, or if you look at the email in which Peter Rengel refuses to offer help, or if you look at the meetings that he attended where he didn't advocate for his client to be a participant in the meeting, where he was excluded the therapeutic patient from the meeting to decide how to kill the story, or if you look at Peter Rengel's participant voting to conduct a lawsuit as part of the Human Awareness Institute to stop his client from communicating to other victims that there might be an alarm here, there might be something to be worried about, you will see the gap between a healthy, loving person capable of leading and doing therapy and a confused, frightened, sociopathic person who will throw his client under the bus to protect the reputation of competency that he does not deserve and that is endangering other clients. Now, what would be the minimum remedy? Like, if you were in Peter Rengel's shoes and you realized that this went on, not willingly, of course, because you refused to engage and talk, but let's say you were forced to watch this video, and so you finally, oh my goodness, I had no idea that's what I was refusing to listen to, right? So let's say you figure out, oh, this is what went on. Okay. So what would be the lowest bar of responsibility if you're a therapist or a competent human being in this situation? Would you alert all your clients, I may not be as good as I thought, and I'm going to evaluate my risks to you, and I'm sorry? Would you call the police on Peter Sandhill before he abuses someone else? Would you do a survey to see how many other people in your organization have been abused in similar ways? Would you do a survey to find how many people have been abused in other ways? Would you call in a competent therapist to evaluate you? Saying, look, obviously I've made a big mistake, people are hurting, and I'm not a licensed therapist. So please look over my cases and tell me what I did wrong and what would be the responsible thing to do. How about apologizing? Do you think you would be willing, courageous enough to apologize to the person who trusted you and who you overpromised to? Could you do that? Now, many American men could not because of shame, because of a deep dysfunction in understanding what love is. And, that's not personal. Many Americans could not do that. They could not apologize. Many fathers cannot apologize to their children. We raise shame-based men and women in this culture. But wouldn't that be the minimum bar? An apology. I'm so sorry for my role facilitating your descent into PTSD. Because if Peter Rengel had been competent enough to advocate for bringing up trauma and addiction, if Peter Rengel had advocated for disclosing a lack of therapeutic licensing, or we don't know what we're doing here, here, and here, or if Peter Rengel had sent out exit surveys to the therapists he recommended and said, I'd like to see how you're doing, this wouldn't have happened. It happened twice with his protege. And if Peter Rengel had asked how he could help, understanding that I asked him for help to recover from something at the time I did not understand what was going on, this would not have descended into PTSD. Because when your therapists turn against you after taking large sums of money to help you, then all their message is about how lovable you are, and that's one of the contracts with therapists. You pay them a lot of money, and whether they deserve the money or not, they tell you whatever it is that keeps you coming back. So some people come back if you tell them they're shit. Oh, this is good therapy. And so the therapists obligingly tell them they're shit and take their money. For others, they want to hear that they're wonderful and lovable, and then the money keeps flowing. But if your therapists end up hurting you more than your parents did and charging you for it, and can't manage to give an apology, all the messages of how wonderful you are kind of ring hollow, don't they? It's just like, oh, you were just doing that when it was convenient for you. Now that I actually value other participants enough to let them know what's going on, now that I'm a threat to your reputation, I have no value. Now I'm a bad person for doing your job for you. It's incredibly depressing and deflating. A lover, for good reason, can hurt you more than almost anyone else. So can a therapist. And in a culture like ours, where a lover is often the opposite of being loving, it just means you're in a sexual chemical codependency in many cases, where your therapist knows you more because you trusted that therapist. A therapist can do more damage. And that deserves a profound level of respect. Deserves being willing to get licensed and be competent, among other things. I am still suffering 7 years later from the second wave of abuse. And the single biggest blow that I endure to this day is that I am treated as an enemy for protecting innocent survivors of sexual and traumatic abuse at high. That is the behavior pattern consistent with suing your client to shut down a public information website that just says this is what happened, here's the emails, here's the recording, this is what happened. We're committed to into me you see, says every high facilitator. But they're also committed to hiding the truth of their own incompetence. That's not medicine. It's not love. It's not leadership. It's not competency. It's not worthy of being a guide. And so while Peter Rengel is no better or worse than any number of people who also have no business being a therapist, he has no business leading people and calling it love. And I hope you value yourself enough to read The Body Keeps the Score, to look at some of the websites that I've created to outline the problems in the blind spot, and to choose therapists who have taken the time to learn, and by doing so put you ahead of their own agendas.